Okay, so you talked about Paine, the output. What about, was he just a madman writing?
When we talk about Tom Paine as the first popular political writer, we don't just mean, I think, that he wrote popular prose that brought political language down to a level where people could understand it and use it. It was popular also in the sense of today. It sold big. He was a bestseller in his time. He sold hundreds of thousands of copies of Common Sense in just a few months. He sold even more copies of The Rights of Man years later when he wrote it in England and then in America too. His writings were popular. People bought them. They read them. They were cheap, by the way, too. They sold for sixpence. Unlike Burke's more expensive, heavy tomes, these were pamphlets that a man could buy and take in hand and read in the kitchen and read in front of the fire and absorb and make something of. So he was, in that sense, a popular writer in a way that almost nobody today, our popular writers, are people like Stephen King, our fiction writers. To have that kind of popularity for a pamphleteer and for someone writing about what many would regard as dangerous and subversive ideas was really quite extraordinary. So his popularity, his democracy, could be seen in the popularity of his writings.
Did he change this nation? I mean, does this nation owe him a debt? Does it affect
even his enemies? John Adams, a remote and resentful and in some ways angry admirer who nonetheless admired him, even John Adams admitted that no one changed the course of the revolution more than Tom Paine. Remember, this gentleman here had only been in America for a year when the mood began to shift. Most people who resented what George III and what the English monarchy were doing in America thought in terms of conciliation, thought in terms of reform. The idea of independence, the idea of Americans taking their destiny into their own hands. This was a world in which there were no free colonies. That was in some ways a desperate idea, a radical idea, an idea genuinely beyond the pale before the publication of Common Sense. After Common Sense had been out for 3 or 4 months, the idea of independence was as common as even then apple pie was in the colonies. He, in a sense, legitimized the idea of independence, legitimized the idea of rebellion, made rebellion not a matter of treason against the crown, but of fidelity to the true principles of nature, the principles of natural right and the principles of self-government. So he had really turned the world on its head, quite literally, and the traitors now became George and his ministers, because King George was a traitor to the principles of natural right, and the true faithful, the true believers of nature and natural right became the American rebels who were trying to make liberty real in this new home of independence that was to become the home of liberty for the rest of time.
So he was putting a spin on things.
Sure was.
You can just stretch. Okay, where were we?
Let's see. We'd actually come to a conclusion.
Okay, this is very hard to get at, and if you can simplify it, I mean, I love it, but the idea that Americans are deeply ambivalent about their own revolution.
Okay, good, yeah.
But that's something you have. It takes a lot of explaining.
Yeah, I know. I think we can.
See if we can. Go ahead.
Yeah, let me do another swab here. I wish it weren't so hot.
I tell you to take off your jacket.
No, that would look very odd.
one sentence only. Okay, sorry.
No, it's fine. I know.
Okay, so
Tom Paine is a symbol of the American Revolution, and the American Revolution plays a deep part in how Americans see themselves. But I think we are also deeply ambivalent, torn about the role of revolution, and in a sense that's very understandable, because the act of rebellion, the act of revolution, the act of overthrowing authority, whether it's the authority of the fathers, the authority of the church, the authority of tyrants, the authority of white men today, dead white males today, the authority of the white race, the authority of patriarchs, is always an act that is fraught with ambivalence, because you take a gigantic chance in overthrowing authority. You take a gigantic chance in claiming power, claiming responsibility, which comes with power. And Americans have always, I think, felt ambivalent about both their revolution and their democracy. They want freedom and fear it. They want power, but worry about the responsibilities that come with it. That's why we've liked representative government. It gives us a sense, through accountability, of power, but at the same time it doesn't give us a whole lot of responsibility, because we leave it to our governors, our representatives, to make all the decisions, and we just throw the rascals out when we don't like the results, but we don't really take responsibility for the process. That ambivalence is built in, I think, to the American view of revolution. And we see it in foreign policy today. So often, America has ended up on the wrong side of foreign revolutions, not simply because of the moneyed interests that are involved, although that's part of the problem, but also because we ourselves are ambivalent when we see it in others about the very revolutionary spirit for which we set the example for others. And that ambivalence runs deep in the American soul, and it, I think, comes out in how we view Thomas Paine, who is not an unmitigated hero, who is not someone we can simply celebrate like Lincoln or Jefferson or Washington or Madison, but someone who brings out in ourselves the ambivalence we feel about our own attitude towards liberty, towards the revolutionary ardor that's a little bit there in our own spirits. You know, when we go through a revolutionary moment in our lives, we sometimes look back on it with fear and trembling. Say, my God, what I risked, what I did, I hope I never have to do that again. And our own revolution, I think, stands a little bit like that in our history. We're proud of it on the one hand, but we're frightened by it on the other. We want to celebrate it, but we're not too anxious to embrace it.
And so Paine is what
Yes,
does Paine fit into all this?
Well, Paine is the little genie who stands on our left shoulder and is the voice of rebellion, the voice of liberty, the voice of taking things into our own hands. And with part of our soul we embrace him, but with another part of our soul we fear him. And on our right shoulder stands George Washington and James Madison and Abraham Lincoln, talking about leadership, representatives, accountability, a government of the best men. And that's a voice which we also listen to. And it's a voice that makes us distrust the voice of Thomas Paine. And so we come historically to distrust the man Thomas Paine. I understand someone took a shot at him over here in the other room when he was writing at his desk, and he's the kind of man one presumes folks would take shots at. You know, we take shots at people like that in our own tradition, the Martin Luther Kings, the Malcolm X's, the Bobby Kennedys, the people who speak in a voice of resistance, a voice of rebellion, who speak in the name of a radical democracy. They often find themselves the victims of, we like to say, lunatics and madmen, but it's lunatics and madmen who sometimes do the work for a part of the American conscience that Americans don't like to think about, but is there.
Very nice. We're going to do it. We're going to have a little shot.
Yeah.
Thank you. You just go over.
We have the one thing we want to talk about is the sort of the empire exceptionalism. You know, that business. That's one. When historians argue about Thomas Paine, one argument you hear over and over again is, Thomas Paine's a cosmopolitan, a citizen of the world. The world is my country, he says. On the other hand, people say the consummate American, the person who celebrated the special mission of America as the home of liberty, the place which would stand as a symbol to all other nations. And it's hard to balance those two views, the world traveler and cosmopolitan who favored no particular nation, and the man who, though he only spent a few years here, is particularly and especially American in his resistance to illegitimate authority, in his independence of spirit, in his rebelliousness, in his celebration of the common man. And putting those two things together is kind of hard, but our whole history, in fact, has been an amalgam of those two things. America has been the special country, the chosen land, But it's a special kind of land. It's chosen for liberty. It's the chosen land of liberty. It's a land of special people, but everyone can come. So that immigrants from all over the world in quest of liberty can come to these shores. Paine, better than almost any American I know, embodies at one and the same time the idea that America stands for universal liberty and that America is a special, chosen land. Those same attitudes can be seen in the American approach to empire, which is at once both brutal and warlike and highly moralistic. Yes, Americans made an empire from the very beginning. President Monroe talked about it. Jefferson himself, after all, doubled the size of the country by taking on and buying the Louisiana Purchase from France. We've always had imperial ambitions, but our empire has been, in our own minds, an empire of reason, an empire of liberty, an empire which we had a right to extend around the world because we were the home of liberty. And as we extended our sphere, we were doing little more than extending the compass of liberty itself. And that goes right down to Woodrow Wilson in Mexico saying, we've gone down to Mexico. This was before World War I. We've gone down to Mexico in the name of democracy. It's America in Vietnam in the 1960s saying we're here in the name of liberty, in the name of freedom. It's America in Kuwait in recent years. It's America in Somalia. There in the name of liberty. There in the name of the empire, yes, of B-52s and gunships and tanks, but behind it, legitimizing that expansionism, a deep belief in the special American mission to bring liberty, to bring the beacon of liberty to the whole wide world. It's the source of our great, great strengths, and it's the source of our most terrible weaknesses.
Paine.
And Paine embodied both of those.
More than embodied, he wrote the words. I mean, that's. We'll cut to him, but
yeah, I mean, maybe I will say I'm hoping in sometimes when I say it, then you can simply cut. And since you're talking about having the words, we could even run in the words. I know I should be a little more didactic and bring it back to Paine. Sometimes.
But I mean, he says this.
Yeah. This is. I mean, I actually wish we had the words. I wish I could quote them right because there's some one. Well, but
we will.
Yeah.
Do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll say one more thing. You can cut into it.
Really?
Thomas Paine doesn't just stand for those sentiments. He isn't just emblematic of those sentiments. He creates them. He creates the language of the empire of reason, the age of reason. He links empire, liberty, and reason together in how he talks about America and its special mission. He uses a language that's been here since the Puritans. It's the language of Winthrop. It's the language of all the great pastors of New England, the city on the hill, the beacon of liberty. But it's a language that he turns into a revolutionary rhetoric of liberty. It becomes now not just the empire of religious freedom, but the empire of liberty for the whole globe. That's how Paine saw it. That's how he described it. And he gave us the language with which to reconcile our yearning for empire and our belief in liberty.
Good. Is there anything? You know what? I know you did this before, but
sure.
Give us an image possibility. Is this idea that these ideas? He's potent when you have tyranny.
Yes, good. I go back to the. Let me do that.
And if you give us specific references, we can cut them.
Yeah.
The idea where liberty is not.
Right, now I'm going to start with that one. Okay. Paine is said to have had a conversation with Ben Franklin that went something like this. Franklin said, where liberty is, that's my home. I always want to be where the free are. And Paine's response was something like, where liberty is not, there I want to be. And that, I think, is a perfect summary of Paine's attitude towards rebellion, towards revolution. It puts him always on the side of the disempowered. It makes him an itinerant of revolution who travels from country to country in search of the oppressed, in search of illegitimate authority, in search of a church out of control, a king out of control, aristocrats out of control, and it puts him on the side again and again of the disadvantaged, of the oppressed, of the tyrannized, and of the victims, not in the name of victimization and celebrating victimhood, but in the name of empowering people to take their own destiny into their own hands and to make their lives their own. He once said, "I never met a man who was happy to let somebody else levy taxes without his own consent. I never met someone else who wanted to be governed by others with no right to participate in that governance." He believed that all men had an interest in, a right to, and a capacity for self-government, and he believed that in most places in the world, other men governed supposedly in their name. And so he found himself always on the side of the rebels, always on the side of the revolutionaries. And if he were around today, I suspect he would again be found on the side of the rebels in Prague in the 80s, in Moscow in 80s, and that takes us back to where...
Well, I mean, I'm not so worried about what he would have done, but,
we can just shift over. Okay, good. Okay, let me do it. Let me do it again, good. Thomas Paine then always asked, where is liberty not found? There I want to be. How many Americans today, how many Parisians, how many Russians, how many Bosnians ask themselves that question? That perhaps is the leading question for true democratic revolutionaries. Where is liberty not? There, not only do I want to be, there I need to be, there I have a responsibility to be. The American who asks himself today the question, where is liberty not, will not find it difficult to give an answer. We know where liberty is not. Liberty is not in our schools where young children are gunned down. It's not in our inner cities. It's not in South Central LA. It's not in the South Bronx. We know all the places liberty is not. That's where every citizen, that's where every patriot, that's where everybody who celebrates the spirit of Thomas Paine ought to be. In fact, that's where America ought to be.
Rousing ending. I'm in tears.